discussion. Yes.
It's a discussion. Yeah.
If there is something that is the head of the table, I'm sitting there, then let's work you.
It's okay. Everything, everyone.
We need circular tables.
All right. Can everybody online hear us? Can everybody online hear us? Great. Okay, well, this is a new room just for this week, just for this one time. We'll be back in the old one. Although I kind of like this room.
Yeah.
It's not a bad room.
Not a bad spot, actually.
Pretty close to my office, so.
That's
Should have
good.
been out for the temperature control.
Oh,
They fixed the weather outside.
Yes.
The temperature control is probably a little bit more.
Yes.
okay. We've got a few new faces joining us. For those who were new, let's introduce yourself to the group.
Right. Hi, everyone. I'm Rachel Morgan. I'm Deputy Director of the Melbourne Biodiversity Institute, and I'm based in the Faculty of Arts. But I also have an undergrad degree in astronomy, and I corresponded with Dwayne. I know some of you from SHAPS, but I corresponded with Dwayne about this group because my future fellowship, which I'm probably not going to get, but you never know, has been thinking about the relationship between diverse cultural knowledges around ecology and astronomy. So that's, and the relationship between Western science and other knowledge systems and how they're being brought together today.
Awesome. Who else is new today? Everybody's been here before? Oh, you have, oh, sorry.
Hi, everyone. This is Wafa Zakri, Professor Assistant of Astrophysics in Jazan University, Saudi Arabia. It's a pleasure to be with you today. My research is focusing on variability on young stellar objects to know the star formation process and evolution. And it's my first time to be in the culture astronomy, and I'm so excited to know more about this rich knowledge and may find some intersection with my field. Yeah.
Awesome, thanks. I couldn't remember if you joined us for the first one or not. I thought you had.
This is the first time.
Everybody else here, great. I do hi, Asha online. You want to say hi?
Hi, I'm Asher, as Dwayne said.
We can't hear
hi.
you, that's a problem. Hang on. Did we do something with my audio?
I don't know. I turned my mic on.
Computer. You need to turn it off on the
So you can go, click on the
Panel.
the current.
No, that's already on.
There you go.
Hello. Hello.
Any professors to take to change a light bulb?
Hello. Hello.
They can hear Asha online. We cannot.
Non-quick.
Technology is great.
Okay, we can hear you now. We can hear you now.
Yay.
Yay.
Okay. Hi, I'm Asher. I'm doing my undergrad in ancient worlds. I've got an interest in archaeoastronomy and cultural astronomy. I'm familiar with a few of you, but it's my first time here today. So thanks for inviting me.
Great. Thank everybody else we've met at least once. One big congratulations. So Trevor Lehman is now Dr. Trevor Lehman. Thesis was formally accepted this week, so hopefully you'll be graduating, walking the line in a few months. Where are you? Hey, we're talking about you.
Yes, I know. Yeah, they're having difficulties with the video button, so you'll only hear my voice. You won't see me other than the picture there on the slide. So, thanks, Dwayne. Thanks, everyone.
No worries. Well done. So we got another one churned through, which is great. So we've got a number of other academics and scholars who are going to be coming in the next few months who we're slotting in the various times to come present for us, which will be really exciting. Martin Nakta is going to speak to us about the cultural interface, slotting him in early part of next semester, and a few others who are here. The webpage online, it's under the cultural astronomy page with the university. So the easiest way to do it is just write cultural astronomy UniMelb, and will be the first link that comes up. But within that, we've got the seminar series, and on that you can see all the upcoming dates, who's going to be speaking, what the topic's going to be about, and the reading. Now, a few of you have contacted me with most of the details, but not the reading. Got to have the readings, right? So please send me that as well. I'll get those up. If you haven't reached out to me so far to book in a time or a date, it'd be great if you can, and we'll slot you in to one of the spots. Keeping in mind the seminar series is not so much about presenting on your current research. It's about teaching, it's about education, and all of us filling the various gaps we have in our knowledges across science, social science, humanities, education, everything else. So we are going to probably have an increasing number of people overseas who are going to want to jump in and be participating. My main focus with this entire thing has always been the graduate students, but of course everybody's invited, and it's great to have so many actual academics here, not just students. So I think it's a great option, great opportunity for us all to learn on this. So next week, or sorry, the next two sessions over the next month are going to focus on positional astronomy. This will be perhaps something the art students won't be familiar with, the science students might be familiar with, but we're going to jump into coordinate systems and all the fun stuff with positional astronomy. But this week is an ongoing discussion with Dr. Wiesenfeldt to continue discussing the plurality of sciences.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether it's better if no, it's.
I'll mute mine, Gerhard, so you can speak, and I won't.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So, mine's on. I hope everybody can hear me.
Everybody here, Gerhard? Yep.
Nico still?
I
No,
just-
Dwayne's yours is still on, isn't it?
I just muted mine.
No, you didn't meet
It's
yours.
still lighting up though. Or it was. Yeah, I think it's still going.
Done.
Oh.
I'm hitting.
No, oh yeah,
This is
two.
why I don't want to.
Okay, I think we have solved all feedback in our room. If there's anywhere else, apologies. So yeah, I just wanted to thought the reading by Alison Wiley today is quite a good follow-up on what we discussed last week, because last week we very much discussed we're thinking about pluralism as a philosophical problem, only one of the major issues that obviously for anybody who's working in the field of cultural astronomy will be actually having to negotiate different communities, and the community of scientists possibly not always the most easy one to work with. So just for background, Alison Wiley is a philosopher of science, Canadian, though she did most of her academic work, I think, in the UK. At least my mental picture of the 90s had her fixed over there somewhere, and was coming very much from classic feminist standpoint theory, that basically the idea is that everybody has their own perspective on knowledge, and therefore it's important to get all different standpoints involved in scientific epistemology, something that in the 90s was not quite fully accepted, but some of the major problems came in the discussion of the science wars that are very much alluded to in this paper, where she now and then when I believe moving back to Canada, I might be slightly wrong on that, she got involved given that also her main research field was archaeology, that was working on, she got involved with the various projects about, archaeological project in the relation with First Nations people in Canada, and the different negotiations that had to be made there. So what I like about this text is that it takes quite a lot of different approaches to this, and the kind of what does pluralism means in practice. And So second part that we might want to talk about after initial round is probably the role of expertise that she focuses on, where she takes on fairly established approaches on expertise by Harry Collins and Robert Evans in sociology of science that anybody who is not from HPS might not be familiar with. So we might want to talk a little bit about that. But beforehand, I'll just open the floor on this kind of, yes, what did different people in the room with very different perspectives take from this text? Anybody wants to take a start, or?
Truly a brave lot we are.
So I don't know if I ever mentioned this before. I think that I did. Like I said, and this has nothing to do with the reading.
Yep.
My expectations are all the graduate students should be here. All the graduate students should be reading the thing and writing down at least 500 to 1,000 words about things they liked, things they didn't like, things they wanted to unpack, things they wanted to explore. Same thing I do in my third year stuff. So for all the grad students I have in here.
Oh, I think I might say something.
I could say, and all the academics in the room should have their own perspective on it. They can rip into the paper or say.
My key takeaway from it is actually something that I touched on last week, which is this kind of ethnocentrism, this ethno-scientific viewpoint. And for me, as a Scotsman coming in and working in Australia and cultural heritage for the last 8 years or so, I constantly have to remind myself that it's such a different context to what I'm used to. So as I was reading this, I kept remembering back to my first ever excavation as an undergraduate. So we went out and excavated an Iron Age burial and we found bones, and we just carried on with it because it's archaeology. You find bones, that happens. So we excavated the grave, we took out the grave goods, we done it all, and it was like wonderful. Then I came out to Australia, and the first time I ever found human remains, my God, the world ended. The coroner was there, the police were there, those different Aboriginal Heritage Councils, people coming from all these different departments. And it was a nightmare scenario. And I kept having to remind myself that this is such a different context, and it's not one I'm anyway used to. So a lot of this was just putting more of a framework around what I've been thinking about in my time here. Anyway, most of it just came down to remembering the basics, and I think that might be one of the key issues in American archaeology and Australian archaeology. In Scotland, if we excavate human remains, it's technically our own cultural heritage because we're Scottish, the person who just excavated is Scottish. And there's hang-ups on it. It's been a hell of a learning curve for me down here, trying to flip that around. And it gives a really interesting perspective on how to consider other people's cultural heritage when I've only ever excavated my own in the past. I'm not sure if that's what you're looking for, Gerhard, but that's the key takeaway for me.
So at the moment we're just running the audio through Gerhard's laptop, is that right? So
I just unmuted mine so people could hear through mine. I don't know if they can or not. We're having. Are you guys getting feedback?
I mean,
They can hear.
probably be more an issue if someone online speaks.
Yeah.
It'd be good if we could run it all through the room audio, but I couldn't work out how to get the sound.
Well, I muted my. You can speak into it, but I muted the thing so you can't hear it. So if somebody online says something, say hello.
Might be easier if we go with the room audio rather than your laptop, because it'll pick up more.
Okay.
I think it is.
the drawing board. Yeah. Oh, we passed the laptop around. Speak into this mic, please. Yeah, that'll.
The good thing is by the time we get everything sorted out,
Yeah.
then nobody's gonna have to answer any questions.
I've gone to the bank and been back.
Sorry?
I've gone to the bank and been back by the time it's all sorted.
Yeah, how's that next week? Otherwise you're dead.
Yeah.
Yeah, try that. Can you hear us online now?
Can you still hear us?
Yeah.
And can someone
I don't know about you guys, but I can't hear anything at the moment.
Yeah, all sound stopped for me just then too. So, yeah. Gerhard, you're muted. Did you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, Dwayne, you're showing up as muted at the moment. I don't know if that helps in the room there.
It's my, if I
This is running the room audio. This is the computer.
yeah, if I unmute mine, everybody can hear that. Yeah, everybody can hear mine. Just use mine. Just use mine. It's close.
Hear that all right now, thanks.
All right.
Okay, so we keep going like this.
Keep going like this.
Just maybe keep the computer near to the person who's speaking just so that it picks up.
Trying to, yeah.
Everybody wants to say something, steps up to the computer, please.
Yes.
Well, I have a question then.
Yeah.
The thing about Canadian Indigenous culture is that it's a huge number of nations in the same way that Australia is a huge number of nations. I noticed in the paper they only referred to one, possibly two. And I know that, for instance, they actually have an Indigenous Parliament in Canada, which is a whole other discussion. But I'm just wondering how dealing with so many different nations, because that's an issue that we face here all the time. I was just wondering if there was anything in the Canadian research that talked about the plurality of nations, because that's a big issue that we face. I wondered if that was something. They tended to talk about just one or two tribes that they work with. I think pluralism's got to involve all that, well, as many nations as possible.
Okay. I mean, one of the things to keep that's quite important to understand what Wiley is doing is that she talks about specific situations, and she doesn't talk about general solutions. It's about, and here we have one particular indigenous group and one particular group of scientists. And so there's kind of general things that come in. So, Jamie, when you said something about Scotland was slightly complicated, I wonder actually how long this will remain in Scotland. Because if you talk about, say, Jewish or Muslim remains, it will be very different from that. It's probably that they never really counted in that part of the remains. Even the human remains that we find would be, they would be basically Christians or pagans that no longer exist in the
I actually have to come up with one of my colleagues who was excavating in Malta recently. They were going through the foundations of an old Roman palimpsest and put down as a Roman villa they were supposed to be excavating. But as my offsider came in with a pickaxe, she went straight through the femur of a Muslim burial. Apparently, the way this had been laid out, there was a Muslim cemetery.
Can you
Yes.
explain a little bit more?
In short, a friend of mine recently excavated in Malta while she was doing so. She put a crowbar through a femur from a Muslim cemetery. As it turned out, we had the Roman ruins at the bottom, and as it came up, those different layers, one of which was a Muslim cemetery. And the Maltese government simply said, oh, that's fine, just move them. So they just took all of the bones out, moved them to another part of the area, but they happened to miss one. And my 22-year-old offsider was almost inconsolable, but she was told by the director, don't worry, it's fine, it happens. And they just moved that one away as well. We have a very different perspective in the UK and Europe in general.
So just a question, but like it's or comment. It sounds as if you've got to come into a kind of pre-knowledge of what defines a Muslim burial or pagan burial, or you've got to have that knowledge already.
In that kind of context, it's very much comes down to desktop research. So before you go out and you do that kind of excavation, you should theoretically know what you're likely to find. And the same would go excavating anywhere in theory, provided you do that due diligence.
Yeah, but again, bringing it back to Wiley, we're talking about communities, and I'm not sure. I mean, I only was involved in the 90s, but my suspicion is there still is not a major Muslim community there present at the moment.
Yeah, probably.
I think it would be probably a very different thing if you do this kind of set installation, say in Tunisia. Or
I think also in Australia, however, sorry to jump in, but I think in Australia there's a very different history as well when it comes to the treatment of Aboriginal ancestral remains, especially when we have a living culture who were objecting at the time and it was still happening. There's the infamous Murray Black collection where somebody just went along the Murray River and dug up every piece of human remains they could find, stuck them in bags, didn't keep them individually, didn't take notes of where they came from, and then they were discovered 50-something years later in the bottom of the Melbourne Museum, just sitting there gathering dust. And it's been a massive, massive task to work out where they're from, who they belong to, whichever group, clan lands do they come from. And that's just the tip of the iceberg at what people did to Aboriginal ancestral remains, with people still there protesting that treatment. So.
I guess I was just going to come in on the question of like what it means to be, to have a distinct cultural point of view, and the way that the article has dealt with that, as a way of understanding the need to bring knowledges together. I mean, I was gonna jump in on what you were saying, Jamie, because I guess a lot of people I work with would question the kind of homogenization of cultures in Europe, as if there's like, as if there's just one Scotland, or just one Malta, right? One Maltese community. That whereas, historically, there's a whole bunch of dispossession that has gone on in Europe. There's a bunch of local communities and, impoverished, marginalized villages that are still impoverished and marginalized. They just don't have, the indigenous heritage. But I mean, I can obviously the fraught situation here and the kind of, of recent violation is more living in people's minds, but I think it still probably exists in all sorts of parts of the world, including in Europe.
I would like to say I'm not advocating for sort of systems.
Yeah. But it is, to me, it's about, I would say that most of the ecologists I work with are probably pretty, not all of them, most of them are pretty attuned to the understanding that they need to sort of step back and respect Indigenous knowledges of country now. But there's still, I think, early days at understanding the difference between traditional custodians and other Indigenous speakers, and that, that right to speak for country versus a genericization of Indigenous, and the fact that there's so much diversity. I would say for most of the Western ecologists I work with, it's still a learning journey around.
Well, that's right. And the genericization has been an issue. So I started working on this stuff in the 1990s, and it was unusual that we were speaking to individual mobs back in the 1990s. I think the other problem we have here too is, of course, there are many Indigenous nations that no longer exist and of which we have no record. And that then creates another problem for archaeologists who can speak for those people. It's all well and good speaking to someone whose mob is still here, but if mob was wiped out 200 years ago, what happens to their remains then? I mean, these are the sort of, that's why it was interesting to me. I think I like the paper focusing on one thing, but the reality for a lot of work, certainly that I do and what I'm hearing from other people, is we're dealing with a much bigger context than that, and to try and negotiate with 200 Indigenous nations about one thing would be really, well, it becomes a problem of practicality, really.
Yeah, okay, but I think what I like at the moment, that we're exactly on page 195 of the paper, what Wiley basically calls this kind of syncretic pluralism, which is basically this kind of basic respect the other culture and therefore deal with this, and this raises a lot of specific questions that come up in terms of historical projects. So yes, one of the things we said, yes, it's kind of historical baggage, say, from my perspective, yes, when I think about Germany and Jewish cemeteries, it's a very different thing. That is, I think German archaeologists, when they come to a Jewish cemetery, they read like you would be, then, oh dear, no, this is a nightmare. We don't want to deal with this. And this goes to the general question. But the thing that I think what I would like to address here with Wiley, particularly, is the kind of thing that when you go beyond this, and then you talk about the different role of different knowledge systems, and then typically, yes, talking to 200 different knowledge systems at the same time is a bad idea. This will not work. So it will be a negotiation of 2, 3, 4 different ones that you can actually negotiate in conversation in the first place. But how to deal with that in that part? Yes, there are broad questions that come up with, but say nobody who's doing cultural astronomy will, apart from me, write a book on all cultural astronomy of Australia, and even that is example-wise. This kind of, I'm using this. I'm not talking about. I'm giving you 200 different astronomical knowledges in one simple report. This is these matters. But instead, we look at specific communities and their knowledge and the different knowledge.
I think that's a great point. What will happen?
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry.
Can I just Morgan?
So I perhaps didn't read the articles quite as
Probably
closely as,
bit.
yeah, sorry. I may not have read the article quite as closely as I should have, and it's been a while since I've read this. But I do wonder, just from reading this, if there's not perhaps at least some confusion between concepts of respect and concepts of equal validity. It strikes me that from an epistemological point of view, Bogosian's really concerned about, I guess, you know, radical relativism in his point of view, and the idea that we might take some types of knowledge and say this type of knowledge is equally valid as this other type of knowledge, which in his point of view goes against essentially scientific epistemology and progress, right? But perhaps there's a question of context, right? In some contexts, certain types of knowledge might be applicable, and in other contexts, not. If you're trying to get to Mars, obviously, you know, some types of scientific knowledge are going to be more valid. But in the perspective of an indigenous population that is trying to make a living in an ecological setting, right, the same type of knowledge system won't get them very far. But I do wonder if there's not some confusion between respect and validity, where, of course, we need to enter in discussions with people that have different perspectives. And I don't have an answer to that question, but I do wonder, you know, for example, if in the question, I think Bogosian's point of view about relativism, if we were talking about something a bit closer to home for some of us, and if somebody were coming into a science class and trying to teach young Earth creationism, would we be standing up and saying, well, their point of view is equally valid? We probably wouldn't. I mean, I certainly wouldn't. But in this other context, where, you know, some people are trying to say, well, this point of view is equally valid, and I wonder if it's just a question of respect. In context, we say, well, I respect the fact that you have religious points of view that say that it's this, but that knowledge is in some contexts appropriate, right? In the church context or in the context of your cultural practices, etc. But in the science class, it's not. And I think there's maybe some really careful distinctions that need to be made about the context and validity and respect that haven't really been teased out as well as perhaps they might be. But again, that's in really good.
I mean, at that point, what Wiley argues first, and there's this important point about the relativism. What do we mean here by relativism? Because she definitely understood, and as I have to admit, I haven't read neither Bogosian nor the New York Times article that he rips into, but that the argument made by Onion and Zimmerman was about methodological relativism. That is that when I do my research, I take those First Nations knowledge on board as a potentially valid explanation, and don't rule it out just because it is indigenous. It's not from within science. I don't take it on board. And that I think, okay, I've got to say, when I've been brought up as a historian of science, I would say, if you don't do this, you're making a mistake. Yeah. So that part, it is at that part, which of course then comes into the question of scientific research at that part. And I think what you can, of course, say, well, ultimately, who makes the judgment calls about those kind of things? In terms of scientific knowledge, is very simple. It's scientists. But we are not in this kind of position. If we're doing cultural astronomy, we don't have to make that kind of call. In the other, the more interesting part, and this is where I think Wiley goes into then, is to think about how can we understand the relationship between the scientific research that do the research, take First Nations knowledge on board as part of the possible discussion, and how to interpret this kind of different forms of expertise that comes in. But before I want to go into the expertise, anything else, Jamie, you want to,
Yeah, on the point that you're making, I think you're right to see, well, I think your point is very good, but I wonder whether it's possible to have respect for another system of knowledge without at least being open to the possibility of its validity. So here, I'm very interested by the name you probably in the last session, which I missed, but Paul Feyerabend, who made this argument about the justification offered for the validity of sort of Western scientific knowledge are very, very hard to support by the standards of Western scientific knowledge. The example that always comes to mind is he was criticized in an early review of his 1975 book Against Method by someone who said, well, come on. I mean, it's all very well to say that there's this sort of anarchic principle of not choosing one system over another, but if you are going to, I don't know, deal with your sick child, are you taking them to a doctor or are you taking them to a crystal healer or something like that? And Feyerabend's response was, of course I would take them to a doctor, but this is not based on any deep knowledge on my part of crystal healing. I haven't actually experimented with the validity of this. I have no personal understanding of whether it works or not. It's basically a cultural preference that makes sense in my thing. So even if, when you say like some forms of knowledge are good for getting to Mars, I think it's important to see, well, no one's got to Mars yet. And parts of, sure. But it's hard to see what the notion of respect is if there is a sort of baseline presumption that at the end of the day, the system that I'm raised in and familiar with is the one that's correct, and the discussion of these two systems is going to be premised on that. So
well, I don't think that was actually the point I was trying to make. I was trying to raise the question, but I think that I was sort of alluding to a question of ecological validity, right, where knowledge or systems of knowledge might be valid in some contexts, right? And or different magisteriums, right? So different ways of knowing might be very valid within some contexts, cultural practices and moral systems and finding food and surviving in an ecosystem, but not for others, not for getting to Mars. And I think perhaps, and I haven't really thought about how to do this, but it just strikes me that there's some work to be done, right, in saying, well, what's the difference between respect and granting validity, and validity in what contexts?
And is disrespect automatic when you think they're wrong? Or when you decide that a particular knowledge tradition is wrong about a particular,
or invalid in a particular
invalid
context.
in a particular context, right?
I think one
The growth of the words.
I think it's also maybe just a question of consent that comes in. It's like, what is the research and how does that impact communities? And if it's not happening alongside that community, is that valid research? Because who is that actually benefiting in a way? And I think also this thing of like when we contextualize research, it's like Western modes of research bleed into all these different contexts, geographical and cultural. And that becomes invalid in this context, but there's just this institutional sort of hegemony around it that gives us the validity. And it's even the things of like, in terms of exploring the solar system, like we don't know that other knowledge systems aren't valid. It's just because we've been operating in this Western sort of dynamic and way of negotiating what is science and what is exploration, that we don't take other knowledge systems into consideration of collaboration.
And I think that's maybe the point of like, if we were to go to Mars, for instance, like if we just go on a Western sort of basis, how valid is that? And who is that valid for? Kind of thing, because I don't think that's valid for the community.
I mean, as we were discussing the other day, I mean, I think we can almost guarantee that should humans try to go to Mars, Indigenous understandings of how communities survive is going to be incredibly important in something that the current Western scientific framework is probably undervaluing. But I mean, I think we can actually take very pragmatic. I mean, I think there's all kinds of principled reasons why you would take these multiple ontologies seriously, but I think you can just answer that question on a really pragmatic level, that the readings from last week and this week give us a good reason for thinking that science can be improved by opening up to pluralisms. That doesn't mean that we're gonna, you know, sort of go everywhere. I mean, you probably can't get a productive working relationship with young Earth creationism, in part because that whole framework is set up to be oppositional to science, whereas, you know, there are frameworks which are not set up to be oppositional to science, in which you can, you know, in which you can work. So, and the reading this week documents ways in which that collaboration can be productive. So, you know, so I think, yeah, I think you can answer it all kinds of ways. One way is just say, well, it's a pragmatic one.
I think it's also like, I mean, the question of values and the question of power can't be separated out from the question of knowledge in any of these things. Like, I just want to, like, why are we trying to get to Mars? Well, who's the person most trying to get to Mars? Not maybe somebody who's going to want to bring Indigenous knowledges with them, right? There's sort of like, there's a whole bunch of things about colonialism and dispossession that are inflected in the ways that we ask different kinds of questions. And to me, like, and scientific questions as well. So, you know, why would we want to go to Mars? You know, is also a valid question that maybe different, you know, perspectives might bring, you know, to challenge science, not just how do we get the best do that. So yeah, I agree about, there is a contextual thing to knowledge, and there's a contextual thing to which knowledges are effective in different contexts. But I don't think it's just as simple as saying, because I think it's also who gets to decide. I think you said that.
I think it's context value.
Yeah.
I think the context of value. So if you look at where have Indigenous knowledge has been most valued in the last 20 or 30 years would be probably in the field of things like pharmacology, where they're looking at Indigenous knowledge systems of various medicines and products that are used for either for healing or for all kinds of processes, you know. And there was a realization at some point in time that there are in fact vast stores of Indigenous knowledge based upon thousands of years of experience about why certain chemicals and products actually work effectively. Therefore, Indigenous knowledge is seen as having high value within that science, but it might not be seen as having high value in other sciences. That's why I think the term context is really important.
I think it's quite interesting. We all seem to have fallen into this exact same Western trap. We've taken the person out of it. We're talking about the ideas and we're talking about the knowledge. It is completely possible to respect the person, but not necessarily the idea. You might not respect the Indigenous knowledge, not think that it has validity, but it doesn't take away from the fact you can still work together in partnership and show respect to the person whilst engaging in this level of plurality. My mother is deeply devoutly Catholic. I do not respect any of her ideas in that space, but she's my mother, so I still absolutely respect her. And as cultural astronomers, that's the bit you have to hold on to. You don't necessarily respect the idea per se, but you still have to respect the person and the group.
I would agree to that. And actually, my response to it, you know, I think you certainly can grant validity without. I think validity and accuracy are different things. And so there's this question of, is this more right than something else? So, well, that's a different question than is something valid within the context. I think the question of respect is different than granting accuracy or rightness or wrongness about something. I mean, it seems like it's a fundamental concept of democracy. Right? You have to be able to respect different values or points of view or something. And I think the point about Indigenous knowledge and pharmacology was actually really interesting as well.
Sorry, are you able to move a bit closer to the microphone? It's quite muffled and cutting out.
Sort of the apocryphal story of pressure bandages being used for, might be apocryphal, I don't actually know, but pressure bandages being used for snake bites in Australia. That knowledge coming from, the practice of burying yourself under earth, burying your wounds under earth if you've been bitten by a snake by some indigenous tribes. That I learned in wilderness first aid course. I don't know if it's I don't know if it's apocryphal or not, but it's illustrative of that kind of knowledge system. There's ecological validity to knowledge. They might not know why it works, right, or within a scientific explanatory system, but it does work.
I personally still think the best practice is not that we get to decide if someone else's knowledge system is valid, unless you have, by example, the snake bite. If you can see it works and that's enough proof for you to believe in it, and then you want to figure out using your knowledge system why, that's one thing. But I think until we let go of this idea that we get to decide, we're still the same.
Thank you. This is very helpful. So, Jamie, you said like you can respect the person without respecting the knowledge. But I think what I really liked about this piece was it gave a case study where it was respecting the knowledge that actually resulted in scientific advance, which was beyond the two knowledge systems in interaction were able to pose questions that weren't available in either of them independently. So it was getting around this problem of saying, well, you respect the thing in terms of just assuming that it's valid. Of course, then we run into problems like, well, there are multiple systems of knowledge available to us in these contexts of archaeology and settler economies. And it just is, well, what are the questions that are important in this system? What are the questions that are important in this system? The result was an approach to the guy who was found on the glacier, which would not have been achieved by the researchers who came in with particular methods. I think that's the real thing. Like, it doesn't matter whether you respect the people. In this case, it came out of respecting the people, but it was respect for the questions that they were interested in that actually generated the scientific advance. And that's only possible from an assumption that this is not like a radically different, invalid form of approaching the world, but one that you might learn from, I suppose.
There's a recent example of this actually in my work with Jajawarong. I've been doing a kind of co-design program with them to develop cultural astronomy tools operated and run by Jajawarong. And part of the William Stanbridge paper discusses Warrapple and Dodgergill, which are the two kind of fungal entities, the great creator spirits. And I tagged myself not trying to work out why they had two different representations in the sky. I looked into seasonality, I looked into language, I thought of all these Western aspects of it. And I was sitting with an elder just a couple of weeks ago, I mentioned to you last week as well. And I said something in passing about this and she went, oh, well, one's fungal, the actual creator, and the other one is his representation on Earth. Is the eagle, look, fungal looks through the eagle's eyes. And it's a kid's story. And she went, oh, shit. I spent weeks reading up on linguistics instead of just reading a children's book that would have had the answer for me. And it was so simple. And I would probably never have got it without that indigenous knowledge just flippantly being passed over.
Yeah. There's one of the common things for things in the sky to have a different name from its terrestrial counterpart. So the emu in the sky, for example, would have, a different name from the terrestrial counterpart. One of the challenges I've been facing on this topic has been with a Center of Excellence proposal that we submitted finally yesterday that was shortlisted on trends in astronomy. And we've got a huge thread of indigenous knowledge and engagement and support running throughout that. And despite the fact that the astronomy community has been very supportive of this, despite endless cultural, sensitivity training and blah, 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 most people still don't really get what it's about. They don't really understand at the fundamental level what it's about. One of the comments was, we were trying to talk about how one of the many things we're going to do is utilize through community collaboration, traditions that talk about transient events that could potentially tell us where to point telescopes, what to look for, because they might give us some kind of information about when they were seen or where in the sky they were seen, or both, whether they're things that are known by astrophysics or not known by astrophysics. And one person didn't like that because they implied that we have these instruments looking up in the sky, finding millions a night, and that's not what we were doing. We're like, well, no, we're not asking the elders to share a million stories a night, you know, but trying to get across what are we really doing here and why is it important to the science that we're doing. And one of the things that came out through the conversations that I've had with elders is that we can, you know, as scientists, we're trying to find these areas of fitting it in. Of course, we're trying to take an outside knowledge system and then pigeonhole it and structure it into an existing scientific framework, which isn't going to work very well. Despite using all the buzzwords of decolonization, you're not actually decolonizing anything if you're forcing it into that framework. But when I've sat with elders and they've had discussions or astronomy events and they talk, the biggest insights that I've found into rethinking problems haven't been talking about astronomy at all. It's they go into a discussion about something and it presents a philosophical idea that to me causes me to approach the problem in a very different way. So what I'm trying to get across to colleagues in astrophysics and other areas of the sciences is that you're not always going to get a one-to-one perfect alignment between, I need to solve this problem. Are you going to give me information I need to solve that? Clearly, yes, I'll put that in. If not, bugger off. Whereas just sitting down and having these conversations and letting people talk will bring in ideas and approaches to projects and solving problems in a radically different way, which is exactly what we have to argue in these grants when it comes to translation of our work into the real world. Well, we didn't mean to try to come up with Wi-Fi, but guess what? When we were searching for Hawking radiation and black holes, they had to come up with an industrial application and something about that worked, and boom, now we got Wi-Fi, or whatever of the 1,000,001 different types of practical applications we have from that. So the utilization of different knowledge systems are of course going to have their context, and of course they're going to have their different questions. So the thing between young Earth creationism and indigenous knowledges, which incidentally is the first reflective essay I give students in indigenous astronomy. I want you to write a 500-word, which is nothing like a page, right? Reflective essay, what are the distinctions between indigenous knowledge and religious creationism? Now, I give them a fairly broad question because every culture is going to have its own creation, right? Every story's got to have, how did we get here? You know, we've got ours, you know, the scientific community, the Big Bang, you know, but how is that? And students are going to come to that problem either from a purely academic situation where they've got no experience with it. Some students are going to have grown up in a background, maybe like I did in rural mid-Missouri, where, you know, you're a sciencey kid growing up in the Bible Belt, it's not going to be very good. Or one woman who's in the class, who's an Aboriginal woman who ended up in a real radical religious creationism cult for a number of years. So people are going to be applying their understanding of this problem in radically different ways, given the context of which I've asked them to address the question. So when it comes to indigenous knowledge and sciences is trying to understand the physical structure of how things work, and we have our own culture around that guides how it's done. But young Earth creationism is saying we're taking a human religious perspective and trying to explain as a counter, as you know, who made that point about how young Earth creationism exists as a counter? Yeah. So you know, we were having these having these discussions about, you know, at what point is understanding the machinations of the universe and understanding cultural interpretations about the machination of the universe, were they different? Which I posed the question to the class. I explained to them what cultural astronomy is about different human cultures and societies trying to understand their place in the cosmos and understand the world around them, both in terms of anthropological cosmology, but also in terms of physical cosmology. And I asked the class, is astrophysics a branch of cultural astronomy? And I'm kind of curious to what you would think. Is astrophysics a branch of cultural astronomy?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's obvious one, right? But we had a lot of discussions in that class.
Well, I think that's not astrology, it's cultural astronomy.
On a slightly related note, the International Astronomical Union has now approved, they've got a whole new Commission 5 on cultural astronomy, which is great. It's a major thing in the IAU, the first time this has been done. But in the background, the hush-hush is that the IAU told the committee, told us, you are allowed, we're going to allow this under one condition. And what do you think that condition is?
Yeah, you told us.
I told you. Who's paying attention?
Checked in psychology classes, not even.
You are not allowed to use the word astrology. That can, if anything astrological or astrology, cannot you use that word, it gets axed. And yeah, of course, astrology, of course, is a branch of cultural astronomy. Amanda?
Okay, I unmute myself and lower the hand. Just so if we go back a little bit to where we're talking about collaboration with traditional owners and the value of working with them to set research questions, I found it took a long time, but I found a really good quote for work that I've been doing otherwise, which talks about the difference even between consultation and collaboration, where consultation doesn't allow for Indigenous people to play an active role in the entire research process, including the design, grant writing and funding, analysis and interpretation of the results, production of reports and sharing of research results in a culturally effective way with community members, just as consultation on its own, whereas engagement and collaboration has those goals. And I've worked on collaboration projects with traditional owners where we got the elders to set the research questions for an archaeological salvage. And it was actually quite interesting because they set questions that we wouldn't have necessarily done from a pure archaeological perspective, which is about, you know, what's the stone tools telling us? What's the information here? Whereas they wanted to know environmental questions and how did that play with the site selection of these particular Aboriginal places? Like, how did the environment impact that? How long ago was it formed? We know it's volcanic. How long ago was that formation process? And so the questions they gave us meant that we had to do a lot more work, but it also produced a really better and more interesting result and a better story and a better way to communicate those findings and making it more relevant for them as well, because they're going to try and use that to create some legislative change for themselves too. So it actually became beneficial research, not just somebody going in and destroying their heritage, but them actually getting some positive results despite the destruction. So I don't know, I found that really in the paper, really resonating to myself with that section 1.4, because it's something that we do and should do more of, I think.
That was a great example, Amanda, because it showed you that when you do true collaboration, then it's all about respecting everyone else's perspective as part of the process, as opposed to cooperation, which is we're going to come and tell you what we're going to find out, which is good.
I worked in co-design a lot before I started my PhD. It taps into that, which is like co-design is this idea. Like, I was going in as a researcher and I worked with the designer in government. And the idea is not that we know the what needs to be made or how it needs to be made yet. You know, you speak to the people that it's going to impact, whatever. We have an expertise at a certain section of it, and that's where our knowledge becomes. But the decision making is democratized, and I think that might be a way to think about it, where it's like there will be situations where the scientific knowledge is the most applicable knowledge at that section of what you're trying to do. But it might not be that it has to, it's not that we come in and be like, we're giving you an app, you know, to solve your issues with wait times at doctors. You know, that's not the first. We don't come in with the idea that we already know where we're going and we're just here to see what you think. I don't know if that is a...
Yeah, I think there's lots of resonances. I've worked in that space a lot in my career, and the thing is that there's a lot of stuff done in the name of co-design.
Yeah, it's not
and even the word democratization is a problem with working with Indigenous communities, because there's Someone once told me, in Australia, black fellas lose on the democracy, score if it's just one person, one vote kind of thing. But but I think those principles, to me, it's humility, right? Yes. It's going in with an awareness of the limitations of your own knowledge. Even if you're the facilitator of that conversation, you don't know everything. You've got to open up the space, and you've got to open up the space for other people to ask questions and for other values to come in the room. The other thing I want to say, being trained in anthropology and sort of being half in and half out of anthropology my entire career, this paper was great because I think it's, anthropologists have grappled with similar questions as well. First of all, it rejects the opposition between it's either got to be purely relativist or there's one answer, and that one answer is the Western answer. It doesn't have to be an either or, it can be a conversation. And we don't necessarily know where we're going to end up about what we decide together, about what those answers might be. And so it just opens up that space a lot more for being okay. But the other thing is, most of the full anthropologists I work with these days, recognize and defend the idea that there are many knowledges and many perspectives, and that we don't have to be uncomfortable with that. And to me, part of the problem is that when you're working with science studies, part of the problem is from a Western science perspective, it comes from an epistemological frame that says there has to be one right answer. And so it's really it's interesting for me to be sort of between those spaces of STS and anthropology, when the anthropologists, of course, assume that the people they're working with have the better perspective on what's going on for them, although there's been big debates about that in the past, with how far anthropologists are willing to go to really acknowledge that Western ways of thinking might be wrong. And those debates tend to circulate around things like magic, crystal healing, all these other things. Whereas I would say, why wouldn't you take your kid to a crystal healer and a doctor, or whoever you've got at your disposal to help them get healed, and there's plenty of stuff on healing practices that are not, the diversity of healing practices and the different ways they operate and how successful they are, not just from a medicinal point of view, but also from a ritual point of view and so on. So I guess I just want to hold a little bit lightly all of that and be okay with sometimes not knowing or not being able to come in and say, we're sure we have an answer. And so for this paper deals with that theoretically as well as practically. It does talk about what she's done, but it talks about that in the context of not judging every statement that a non-Western knowledge automatically puts us into a space of either relativism or saying that Western science is wrong. We can have both and.
Epistemologically, though, there's I think there's some really interesting questions. I mean, and I tend to agree with that. It's sort of following it's either anything that's slightly relative is automatically radical relativism. But there's also this whole issue of conversations, and I was trained in anthropology as well. One of the stories studying anthropology at the National History Museum in Paris, and one of the things that we were doing when we were doing ethnographic training was the stories around Dogon and African astronomy and Marcel Briol's work there around the Dogon knowledge about Sirius, and whether they actually knew that the partner star of Sirius that's invisible was actually there, and related knowledge about Jupiter, etc. And I don't know that story has ever been resolved. There's a whole lot of debate. It's been a long time since I've looked at it, but I think some of the points that were sort of brought to us in terms of ethnographic interactions based on discussions of that story was that we have to be careful when we enter into discussions with people that are our informants, if you will, or our partners, cetera, because there is a possibility of essentially confabulation. So on the one hand, with real story, there's, you know, they essentially say, basically, this is a confabulation. The oral stories that he took from the Dogon people were either the result of knowledge that he himself might have shared, or more likely had been some Western knowledge had been incorporated into the culture through contacts with earlier scientific expeditions, et cetera, and that he took the oral stories that he recorded as, you know, essentially as ground truth, but that they had actually were the result of earlier contacts, et cetera. And, you know, I don't know where we stand on that. I think, you know, Dwayne would probably be the best place to sort of talk to this. I don't know how we address this question of do we take oral stories as ground truth, or do we consider them as the possible results of cultural admixture over time, et cetera?
Well, Lynn Kelly is going to come in a month or so and speak about orality and memory, and understand the context of how stories are created and how they layer multiple levels of knowledge, and how that knowledge is embedded within narrative and song and dance, and how it's shared and why it works. That's something we're going to unpack. Now, this does tie into the research side of cultural astronomy, because oftentimes when you have something like that, there's an explanation. It's usually like, oh, it's going to be this or that, when in most cases there's a whole plethora of things at play. So, for example, the story of Norala. So this is the story of what's known as Gosses Bluff Crater out in Central Australia, about 2 hours west of Alice Springs. It's a ring-shaped mountain range that is described in Western Islander traditions as where a star baby fell from the Milky Way while her mother and other women were dancing as stars in the Milky Way. He fell out of the sky as a fiery star, hit the ground, drove the rocks upward, and the Coulomb and the Turner fell on top of him, so the parents can't see him. Now they take turns back and forth, the morning star and the evening star, looking for their lost child today. And people will explain how you tell children, don't stare at the morning star or the evening star, because the parents might think you're the child and come take you. And they'll start describing the ghost lights, the min lights, as these spirits looking for their children. So the question, you know, that I asked was, well, we know, as we do, that this is an impact crater, and Aboriginal people have a story about it being an impact crater. Therefore, they would have known it was an impact crater. So we have to unpack a few things there. According to Western science, what we're looking at is the central uplift of the bottom of the crater that's 2 kilometers deep, because 142 million years ago, when it was created, that wasn't the surface. The surface was 2 kilometers higher. So what you're looking at is a result of differential erosion. Yes, it was formed by an asteroid impact. And yes, the people talk about a fiery object coming out of the sky and hitting the ground and moving it upwards. So yes, did they come up with a narrative explanation for that in the same way that Western science will come up with a narrative explanation for that? Is it a matter of, well, there were arguments made when I had the paper published that talked about this. Oh, well, they must have got this from other Western scientists. Well, it wasn't known until the 1960s, right? And the stories go back much further. Another one is, it's entirely possible that bowl-shaped things in the ground that look like something fell into them, people are going to say, look, something fell out of the sky and hit it. If you don't believe me, look at all the people on Google Earth trying to find craters using Google Earth. Every pond, every somewhat circular object, oh, it's a meteorite crater. It's a meteorite crater. Is it simply that is one of a number of different stories about formation features that happen to coincide with the Western science explanation, when there are going to be many others that don't? I saw another one about a hilltop. Western name is Mount Purvis in South Australia. And the top of it looks like a volcano, really. But I think it was even Charles Mountford, but that's a whole other thing, was saying that, oh, this is where the stories talk about it. Maybe it's a meteorite crater. He thought it might have been a meteorite crater because it looks kind of like that. But the story he told had nothing to do with that. The story he told was there was basically a community there. There was an old woman who loved to eat this particular fruit. The colloquial term now is a pig face fruit, right? And as it turns out, pig face fruit has a number of different medicinal qualities. One of them is it's a laxative. And she ate way too much of this particular fruit, started getting pains in her stomach, went to the top of the mountain, and basically farted so hard the mountaintop blew off and sent boulders flying in all directions, right? Now, you can look at that and think it's a bit funny or it's not a bit funny, but it was explaining a story of why you don't eat too much of that particular fruit. And I think what gets taken out, and we're kind of diverging a little bit away from the science aspect of that, but comedy is a way that we utilize things to tell stories. It's something that is memorable, which is why we love comedians so much. And in an narrative format, when you're talking about our old traditions, sex, violence, things outside the normal day experience, comedy, those are going to be utilized because they're memorable. So this becomes one of the challenges whenever we're looking at people like me who are sort of, as I used to do, scouring all these stories for all the science behind them. It's easy to find science there. Is that really what the people meant? Is it in the same way? Is it a coincidence? Is it an idea that looks similar, like pareidolia? If you look at what's the most famous supernova rock art in the world? You know what I'm talking about? Nobody knows.
In New Mexico.
Yeah, it's the one in New Mexico, right? This site, which is up on a thing. You always see this picture, and it depicts three things. Well, four things actually: crescent moon, a bright star-like motif, a hand artwork, and then below that something that looks like a fiery meteor, which people will say is a comet. And people conflate comets and meteors all the time. Comets and meteors are not the same thing. Right? They don't even look the same. But everybody thinks that a bolide, a fiery fireball, is what a comet is. It drives me nuts. Now, the first time somebody two things came out. So one of them was that, people don't understand the context in which they see this art. When they see what it looks like and where it is, they're like, it changed their perspective, that it's up on this ridge top. It's not easy to see. And people are like, oh, that's not quite what I thought it was. They thought it was this giant thing the size of the marker board in front of them. Right. But also the paper that published the very first representation arguing that this rock art was depicting the supernova of 1054, which was first really prominently visible around the 4th of July, 1054, when you had a distinct crescent moon, and then you had this supernova the supernova directly above it. It would have looked similar to the rock art, right? So that was taken by everybody as example of supernova and rock art, which, and I got to talk about how this relates to feeding back into communities in a second, but the very next paper in that edited volume, the next page was a whole refutation of it, talking about how this motif is very common across that whole part of the world, and in fact around the world, as Venus and the crescent moon. You see it on the Islamic flag, you see it everywhere, all around the world. You see those two motifs, and there's widespread oral traditions that linked into those motifs. But the supernova is a lot sexier.
Yes.
Supernova is one that everybody liked. And then people, when they want to push their pet theories, will be like, oh, see, you knew about supernova. Isn't this amazing? We all knew about supernova. And then at which point it gets fed back to community. And then when those community members start saying, yeah, this is a supernova, because knowledge of that was fractured over time by whatever multiple things. That site was abandoned for a period of time before it came back, even before the Europeans came. There was a rupture in that passage of knowledge. Information was lost or fragmented to some degree. Here's an idea that scientists have proposed. The scientists say it must be true. Yes, this is a supernova. And all of a sudden now at the site, it says supernova rock art. Everywhere you go in the world, everybody knows this is supernova rock art. Neil deGrasse Tyson's talking about supernova rock art. Even Carl Sagan talked about supernova rock art.
That's where I first heard of it, watching Cosmos in 1981.
Yeah, I mean, you go back and you unpack and you look into it, you're like, wait a minute, this isn't right. And then Ed Krupp, who is at the planetarium, the observatory there in Hollywood, Griffith, he had gone back and seen academics writing about these supernova, and this ties in with the Dogen stuff, by the way, ties in with these claims of supernova Native American rock art, and it was one of these Indiana Jones type things. I even wrote about it in the book, about how he had to actually go out and find these places, going through canyons, getting bit by snakes, almost dying, and finally finding it, and not finding what was depicted in the publication, but a whole series of motifs around it in which the supernova ones were taken out selectively and published with nothing else around it, with no context. And then you looked at everything else, you're like, well, hang on, this is not right. And then you start looking at the other stuff and realizing it probably has nothing to do with supernova whatsoever. But that also ties in with the Dogan stuff, because if you look at even the community members when they were writing stuff, the publications talking about this being Sirius B, this dwarf companion star to Sirius, there were a lot of motifs that were erased from that to highlight what you wanted people to see. So that selection bias from the academics who aren't supposed to be doing that kind of crap, right, which is prominent in cultural astronomy research, was a real issue because it ties into feeding false information about the communities, people coming up with their pet ideas and pushing them. There are two guys up in Central Coast, New South Wales, who look at rock art of whales with the cicatrizing scars, which elders have explained to me, and saying they're UFOs. You can see them on Ancient Aliens. They're publishing books, and they're giving lecture series, which aren't cheap, talking about this, and they get a few elders on their side, you know. So there's this whole weird commodification of knowledge depending on personal bias, on professionalism and archaeology and anthropology and stuff that I think ties into that. So it's really a weird situation when you start to look at these stories and say, did this culture understand or not understand? We're probably asking the wrong questions.
Yeah.
Whether most stars in the sky are binaries. So if you say there's a companion star to it, you're going to get it right. But that's assuming that they're looking at this in a Western framework. It doesn't make any difference. And I think trying to make those parallels, because the argument about the parallels, they had some kind of almost superhuman knowledge that we don't have, that they knew about this star that you can't see without a telescope, without spectroscopy, that either they had some kind of superhuman knowledge, or it was, and our other most hated topic in cultural astronomy, I'm not saying it's aliens, but it was aliens. And that's the motif that is, sorry? Well, this is it, yeah. So lots of traditions talk about ancestors coming from the stars, but we nowadays have taken on this weird, I mean, this is your field, right? Psychology. Where did the little gray men with the big heads and big eyes and little mouths come from? And all of a sudden they went from Martians to being Zeta Reticulans and everything else. Sorry? Not the psychology, but the human perception of organization.
I've got to say, those when I was 11 and I was working in Search Dog with Len and Emily, talked about the Dogon myth and uncritically, and it was all about, oh my God, how did they know? I saw Cherish the Gods of the movies. I was 11. I thought it was incredible.
It's a compelling.
It is.
Okay. The reason these stories have survived in indigenous cultures is that they are compelling.
Yep.
And that's what you're talking about. And the competitive compelling narratives which were designed for particular purposes. That's the validity. And it's the unpacking, as Roman's saying, it's the unpacking of the purpose.
Right.
Saying that it's got a geological explanation where it's really a dietary explanation is an interesting bit of sort of. You almost need to write a book called The Fake News of Archaeology.
I think lots of people are
It applies even to medicine, right? Because if you think about like the anti-vaxxer thing, when you look at that, if you were just to be like, oh, that's the end. But what you realize is that it's communities, often women end up in the world of, heading towards I'm just going to go for crystal wellness rather than seeing a doctor and people of color, because the Western medicine was based on those same narratives that white men were being like only everything was to be designed for them and didn't work for others. That was their fault. And so it's like we have to just, I guess it's just an emphasis on, even when there are like objective things we can always be basing ourselves on the narrative. Yeah, we are, exactly. We work on our own narratives. Really compelling stories that men and women are, for a long time.
Humans love compelling stories.
Exactly. But I think my point is more working in psych and this area and growing up in a family of like a lot of medicos is I think sometimes I feel like there's less willingness to be wrong and to think of ourselves as not objective, you know, and it's like, actually, we're all not objective. We're all humans. There's a kernel of truth probably in what every single scientist has found, but it's colored and you know, given their own lens, necessarily critique the Western science as much as we validate other things. But like, agree, you know, it's not about accepting everything.
And we are all this is another thing that I think is important. We are all susceptible to the Dunning-Kruger effect.
Yeah.
It gets used as a pejorative against, you know, the people who we think are stupid or idiots or whatever, but all of us are susceptible to the Dunning-Kruger effect.
Can you remind me what that is?
This is where people who don't know something think they know a lot about a topic.
Yeah,
they're ignorant of it.
Yeah.
So I had this argument with some amateur astronomers in a I think I probably talked about this recently, one of the last two seminars. I rambled on about it a bit, but it was the idea that me trying to discuss some of these areas in indigenous astronomy where there was eclipse prediction, where there was variable star observations, where there are things that even the hardcore scientific community would find quite interesting, and a handful of amateur astronomers say, "Oh, this is impossible. Aboriginal people couldn't do this kind of stuff." I'm like, "No, they could, and here's how it worked." They just didn't want to listen to it. No matter how much evidence you put forward, I don't believe you. I don't believe you. It doesn't matter. And I made some crack about, you know, the Dunning-Kruger effect applies to everybody, which of course that little microcosm of the community loved to use that as a pejorative to everybody else except them.
Yeah.
You know, everybody else is wrong. We know everything. They don't. They took that as an insult, me attacking them. I said, no, including myself, especially so, because there's so much that we, you know, in cultural astronomy, we can't be expert in everything. And there are a lot of areas of which I should be more knowledgeable about that I'm not, which is the whole point of why we're doing this series in the first place. And I think that it's so easy for us to forget that. And in the context of cultural astronomy, we feel discomfort in moving outside our little comfort zones. We don't want to go into other areas, but it's easy to put up the facade like we know enough to fool everybody else if we don't get asked that question. So I know I'm digressing a little bit, but that's one I think is important to reiterate.
Dwayne, I want to just come back to the story that you were talking about.
Yeah.
The story of what could be a volcano or could be an impact crater.
Yeah.
But at least in your interpretation was really a dietary caution about eating too much fruit.
Yeah.
And
that was my interpretation of what I read, but I have no idea what the community says.
Sure. No, but there's something there, right? It comes back to sort of the epistemological question. That I really, honestly, I don't have an answer to. I'm just trying to keep the conversation going. But that there's a difference between accuracy and ecological validity. Right? And so a story can be valid in lots of different ways, right? So in this case, right, if we take it on its face value, right, this story is valid as a cautionary tale about eating a particular type of fruit. Now, whether it's accurate in terms of from a you know, our scientific perspective of, is it an accurate explanation of this was an impact crater or it was a volcanic explosion or whatever, is a different question, right? And requires a different set, and is a different context, and requires a different analysis to know, is it valid in that context. I think that sort of takes back. Each time you're questioning whether something is valid within a given context, it can be valid in this context, right? We can establish validity within a given context. But you know, accuracy then becomes, you know, is a totally different question. Is it really this? Is it really that they knew about an impact crater? That I think is you know, kind of a different question, isn't it?
Yeah, well, years ago, I gave a talk at the Academy of Sciences in Canberra, and it was about this sort of cultural interface between indigenous knowledge and astrophysics, how it's contested. There's areas of connection, areas of disruption. And I tried to explain to the community, look, there's a lot of things we can learn from this if we stop treating it like it's quote unquote myth and legend, as meaning it can be dismissed, but really understand the context for what it is. There's a lot of things that you as a community can know. And somebody asked me, you know, what is it that we can really learn from this? And so I'm going back to a time I did it right out of my PhD. I didn't have as clear of an answer back then as I later did. I was trying to find specific examples, which I mostly came up with when I started working after my PhD. But I did pose the question. I said, well, okay, we all know about the stars in this room. We're a bunch of astrophysicists. We know all these gory details about X, Y, and Z. Take any one of us, put us out bush for 2 months with no modern technology. Most of us aren't going to survive. But you can survive if you know how to read the stars and you know how to use the environment around you. So these stories you might think are entertaining, an exotic curiosity of the other, whatever, however you want to frame that. If you look at them as books, as oral books, then that's going to be all the life lessons you need to survive out there. Now, whether or not you understand the dynamics of how a galaxy moves around doesn't make any idea of difference out here. But the application of that knowledge is going to be based on totally different questions you want to know about the sky if you're out bush for 2 months or 2 years on your own versus when you're in a lab or you're in an observatory trying to ask questions. Totally different context. So I think in terms of the work that I've been doing, I don't even use the term validity anymore because it became such a problematic term to even think about unpacking. I was like, there's two different valid, no, they're valid in their own right. They're asking different questions. They're about people trying to understand the world around them, asking very different questions in different contexts, using different methods. Like anything, there's going to be some crossover. And the work that I was doing in this area of cultural astronomy is looking at that intersection between those two worlds, knowing there's going to be a lot of stuff that doesn't fit in there at all. You can't fit a square peg in a round hole. You know? So that was the kind of stuff I was doing with them, which is why this is such a weird area to work in.
I mean, accuracy has context as well, doesn't it? I mean, something's only accurate depending on what the question you're asking is, which gets back to Rachel's point about, you know, this question of values in science and what kinds of questions are you going to ask matters. And I mean, getting back to the reading, I mean, I think the point is that, I mean, we know even within Western scientific frameworks, things are accurate depending on what your framework is, what kind of questions you're asking. But I think, you know, sort of the reading is making the point quite well that it's those interactions with other kinds of knowledge that can help you to refine those questions or to ask different questions, you know, sort of expand your understanding of those questions in ways that can be quite productive. And yeah, I mean, again, nothing Rachel said about that, finding that space between, you know, sort of relativism and there's only one epistemology to try. Which both, you know, the reading last week, you know, argued for very well as well. I mean, I remember Donna Haraway speaking in Melbourne, but I don't remember exactly what she said, so I'm going to have to paraphrase wildly. But she was saying that, you know, we're not interested in just taking some kind of relativist approach. Things are interesting when knowledge systems rub up against each other. And when there's friction, and it's out of that friction that you can actually generate something that's new, something and things that can be productive for all parties, for both parties. So it's you know, sort of, it's not having this idea that, you know, these other ontologies and epistemologies only exist as resources that, you know, our pharmaceutical companies can extract things from, and then we'll bring them into our epistemology, which is obviously correct, and, you know, we'll sort out what's true and from what's not true. The point is that those interactions can actually improve our own epistemology.
I think the other thing, I just wanted to come back to the oral history question as well, because I mean, most of what most anthropologists deal with is oral, right? It's not always the case. I did most of my work in Western contexts where people wrote a whole heap of stuff down, but you know, this kind of idea that we've got to sort of judge whether stories change over time. Well, of course they freaking do. Like all our stories change over time, so do our science stories. And so then it's what purpose? Like understanding that, okay, in some contexts, if you're going to judge, did this knowledge predate somebody else coming in with a version of it? Well, sure, then it's relevant to know exactly when that story came in. But for some people, you know, a friend of mine has his story where he worked with Western scientists around stuff, and he was a little disappointed to find that the species that was his totem species was fairly recently, relatively recently introduced to his country, like in hundreds of years ago, not thousands or millions or time immemorial like he had thought. But at the same time, you know, it's still his story. And just because it's only 800 years old in that place doesn't make it not important. And so, because you know, there's a tendency to think well, Indigenous knowledges have to be reified at a certain point and then it cease to be Indigenous knowledges. No, the people who are constructing fire practices on country now out of both their own collective stories that have managed to survive and that they've managed to hold on to, and some other stuff that they're having to pull together because the world was messed up for them for so long. Their stories are still, they're living, right? And they're evolving, and that, like, we shouldn't be, I don't know, I don't think you're implying that we should be uncomfortable. It's a specific question about a specific, you know, a specific case of scientific validity. But I just guess, like, knowledge is always lived in practice. And part of what we deal with weirdly in the kind of colonial Western frame today is that we distinguish between science and technology, like the science exists on its own and then there's the practice, whereas, you know, in most of human history, there's the knowledge and the practice together all the time, and it's always evolving and always being shaped and being drawn from ancestors and all the other things.
Including in Western, I mean, that's very recent distinction, even in Western European knowledge practice.
Yeah, I mean, 2 points. One brief one. I think one of the problems in this discussion here as well is that we talk about two actually very different things. One is affecting our interpretation of Indigenous stories and the validity of our interpretation, independent of what the stories say. The other thing is what actually Indigenous knowledge holders have to say to science. Yeah. And that is a completely different thing. And I mean, typically anybody who's writing a PhD or anything else in cultural astronomy doesn't have to concern yourself with the second part of the question in principle, only with the first part, and that is particular. But what I like particularly about what Wiley has to say, that links up to what Martin has just said, is the way to frame the question in actually a very broader question that for the moment can leave out the particularities of the case altogether. I just want to share one slide here, which is basically bringing back the idea of that came from, that she uses a well-established idea about expertise from Harry Collins, Richard Evans, Robert Evans, written almost 20 years ago, before mobile phones came in, or before smartphones came in. It is basically the STS problem of understanding how expertise works, even though expertise doesn't work didn't work as well as it used to be. And so I just want to draw your attention to the kind of second major role of specialist expertise. This is when we talk about specific questions and what do people know. So what basically Collins and Evans say in the first place, everybody has some sort of expertise, independent from where you are on. So the kind of BMAT knowledge is, yes, this is the pre-smartphone. Two people sitting in the pub and said, well, I know this. Nothing more or less. The popular understanding would be more or less the Wikipedia. I've read Wikipedia on it. But primary source knowledge, I actually read some articles. So this is not really something that is particularly relevant for us. What is, and what Wiley brings in, is the question of interactional expertise and contributory expertise, which actually goes back to what Amanda said earlier about consultation versus collaboration. So interactional expertise, that's basically grown out of self-experiment, so to speak, that Harry Collins did when he got into interaction with gravitational wave communities. As somebody has no ideas about gravitational waves, no training in physics or mathematics whatsoever, but to get to the point that he could understand what they were talking about, could ask questions, the interactional expertise. Hey, we can talk about those kind of things. Whereas here's the crux of Wiley's paper, that contributory expertise means that you can actually bring something to the discussion that other people don't know, other specialists don't know. And this is, I think, where we talk about when you look at about Indigenous knowledge within science, as we bring something there, these perspectives brings out something in that is fruitful for the research. We don't know what, it probably doesn't answer a specific question. Yes, not a question directly getting to Mars, or how to work with the field problem or any of those kind of things, but nonetheless brings in something. Again, something that Colin said is not particular, that we have a lot of contributor expertise in of people who are not scientific specialists. The big field is medicine. Communities of people with rare diseases obviously often know much more about the expertise about this particular disease than the medical specialists in the field, because the medical specialists have so many other things to do. But here it's a group of people who have existential concerns just with one particular medical condition. Therefore, they gather so much knowledge that they actually take seriously. In the same way, we have lots of things where you can say, here is actually indigenous knowledge holders that have a very different perspective, and they bring that in. Something that Shang last week mentioned, oh, they bring this to the table. They bring something to the table, therefore they're allowed to sit on the table, whereas young Earth creationists, not really, other creationists, and this is basically the Michael Roos strategy. Here we can talk about methodological naturalist. This is a topic you are very interested in. Let's talk about this with the very different discussions here. So in that way, yes, in this part, accept that as a potential contribution here, not a contribution that will always be worthwhile, but that's very much the same for anybody in any field of science whatsoever. So just the final thing probably from that, I can keep that on, but the problem is that arises from that is what is actually happening to the indigenous knowledge in this process of contributory expertise. So how is this treated? How is it properly safeguarded? This kind of classic pharmacological problem. This here the pharmaceutical industry has another gold mine to dig. Yeah.
Can you explain what mimeomorphic?
Mimeomorphic is okay. Polymorphic is has different shapes. Mimeomorphic is the aim to be almost immediate, that you don't think about these things. Basically, you come to the table and you talk. It is not that, oh, I need to look this up, I need to check this. Which typically happens, yes, let me just browse Wikipedia and let me find out. Whereas the mimeomorphic is the kind of classic example from Evans Collins's laboratories, like people just talk about stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah. Again, anybody who ever wants to have a reference on that, the Wiley paper, it's a very useful thing to work on everything about validity, because you talk about expertise in specific context. Many of the complex problems can actually be solved. I think when we look at these kind of situations, we don't talk about the dictionary or the encyclopedia of indigenous knowledge versus the dictionary encyclopedia of modern science, and which is more accurate when we talk about specific problems. Yes, I can send this slide around with a reference if you want to. Yeah.
Did anybody have anything online that you wanted to say? I know we don't get much of an opportunity for you to jump in. I was going to ask Elizabeth if things we spoke about in here earlier reminded you of our chat this morning with Professor Pocket.
Yes, they did. Yeah, it's hard to put it into words because it all applies and fits in. And yeah, I think the thing that was coming to my mind also, at one point there was a conversation of, if you hear a story from a people and you're trying to decide, okay, well, is this their knowledge or is this influenced by like modern Western thinking? Is this kind of, I think the thing that came up the most in the conversation with Professor Nakata today was the idea of letting go of the idea of indigenous knowledge being something from the past, that we're trying to obtain some sort of archaeological record of knowledge, but it's a living, breathing, dynamic knowledge system that grows and evolves over time. Especially if, I mean, like Australia, you think about how long the people have been in Australia. If you're talking like 60,000 years, well, the stars are going to move and change. And so that knowledge would have to continue to grow and change and adapt as those star positions move or whatnot. But I think that was my biggest takeaway from that conversation. I think that kind of applies here too, is just understanding that it does change. These are systems of knowledge and it's not a stationary. Sometimes we'll get a record of it, but that's almost like a picture of a moment in time. It's not, that is the knowledge system because it's continually growing and adapting and evolving.
Anybody else online want to jump in and say anything? No pressure if you don't, but just want to give you the opportunity because I know we get quite engaged down here.
I think someone was mentioning earlier, and it's still been a little bit hard to hear, but about pharmaceutical industry, for example, and Indigenous plant knowledge. I do know that there are several examples concurrently happening with someone I know in the industry who is actually a pharmacist by trade, became an archaeologist later on, and has been working quite closely with some communities up in Queensland in order to patent and produce modern medicine using Indigenous plants as a particular basis, and also ensuring that the community where this knowledge comes from is getting appropriate remuneration benefits and acknowledgement of where this knowledge has come from, and also involvement in the process of this being turned into a pharmaceutical medicine. There's also changes in the Aboriginal Heritage Act in Victoria under Part 5A that mean that people can actually lodge intangible heritage registrations over that particular type of knowledge, so that if somebody was going to come along and commercialize it, they have legislative protection under the Act in order to kind of, as an IP kind of thing. So it's moving slowly, I guess, people kind of slowly incorporating and approaching this kind of co-design. But I think it's kind of talking to that, we can constantly learn, we can constantly build on the knowledge that we have. I really liked the 10.4 section because it kind of reiterates our approach and kind of what we do and try and working together. How does it benefit our industry in addition to how can we kind of help this benefit Indigenous cultures that we are working with? Like, you want them to walk away feeling that the exchange has been positive and beneficial to them, not just us coming in and walking away with thank you for the knowledge, if that makes sense.
Something like 80% of all new pharmaceuticals is derived from Indigenous sources. So it's a huge, huge industry, which is causing all kinds of havoc and chaos because pharmaceutical companies love taking it, patenting it, restricting it, selling it, and not giving the money away to anybody else except shareholders. That's it. Of course, that's not Australia. That's global. Anybody else online want to chip in or say anything? No worries if you don't.
Don't know if we've got enough time, but I can give an example of where it's easy to get locked into one train of thought, and it's a good lesson in sort of being very amenable to different approaches, different understandings. When I was doing my research, I wrote a paper on the orientation of Miami in the stars of Orion. Now, I came across a paper by R.H. Matthews that described a bird bung ceremony. You probably know it more likely as a Bora, male initiation ceremony. And the elements of the proceedings of the ceremony seem to indicate that Miami in Orion is oriented the same way that Orion is seen in the stars from the northern hemisphere perspective. So right side up in the northern hemisphere, upside down in the southern hemisphere. That fitted the narrative as far as it looked. I thought, okay, now we know how he fits, how Biome fits in the stars of Orion. Now, since publishing the paper, I've come across a couple of examples where the other orientation is just as possible. Now, the stars in Orion, I don't know if you've noticed, but they're very symmetrical. You can orient the figure in Orion is one way or the other. So yeah, I came across a couple of examples where to fit the dreaming narrative, the right side up viewpoint is more relevant than the upside down viewpoint, the perspective, because in a couple of occasions I've come across in two different language groups, where they use a high point on the ground side, a hill or a mountain, as a stepping off point or a jumping off point into the sky, and it makes more sense for him to be the right side up and observed rising on the eastern horizon, where he steps off with his feet and goes into the sky. Whereas if he was upside down, as in the other orientation, it doesn't seem to work. He'd be pushing up on his hands to try and get into the sky. So I'm in the process right now of writing a follow-up paper to say that the other viewpoint is just as valid. It all depends on the dreaming that's associated with the narrative. So yeah, good example of just trying to broaden the perspective and trying not to be too narrow.
Trevor, the Daisy Bates paper you did from Oldie also showed described as being upside down, right?
Exactly. So that's why in this follow-up paper I'm currently working on is I call that the canonical orientation, and the other upright, the non-canonical form. So it depends on how it fits the dreaming narrative. So anyway, that's just an interesting aside. Indicate, sort of illustrating that perspective.
That's half my.
You just have to be careful that the first paper is published first.
Someone's
refuted this.
Because you get to cite your first paper a lot.
Yeah.
Let's say if you want if you want to get a paper with the most number of citations, publish something very obviously wrong, and everybody's going to come in and tear you apart. You get huge citations on that, going to boost your H index.
I was gonna say, might help, Trevor. I'm currently doing a study on like people creating constellations, and then when it's changes its orientation and then moves, what happens in terms of how do they change the constellation shape, or do they change their narrative to reflect the changes? And so a principle in visual perception psychology is often things that are really relevant for the visual system are object invariance. Basically, if it's upside down, you still see it as like a face or a human or whatever, but you might then explain it in a different way. So it might be both of those things. You might have it the right way that people have seen it, but they then change their explanations to match how they're viewing it at a certain point. If they're standing over here, if they're standing over here, but they still see the exact same picture. Does that make sense? So that's a weird one from visual psych, but it could be that you're not necessarily wrong. It's just like, I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay, well, it's 4 o'clock. So, Mike, is it Gerhard? Is there anything you wanted to finish up with?
No.
Okay. So I want to thank Gerhard for coming in and kicking off this conversation. We are going to meet back in Old Arts in the normal place in 2 weeks.
4 weeks.
Oh yeah, that's right. We got all right.
Easter, right?
Easter, right. So in a month, I will start. I will do the next following two sessions where we're going to deep dive into positional astronomy, and I want to give cultural astronomy context to all of that. What we're going to be doing. So probably a little bit less of a discussion. I mean, it's still open for discussion, of course, but it's more just punching through some of the heavier material when it comes to the astronomy side of things. And then we've got a few other people. Tim's giving one. Everybody here, all the academics should be giving at least one in the coming few months. Tom, you're giving one, I think, next semester. If you want to get that.
Later on.
Yeah, later on. Well, I'm not talking about the month, so you're like 2 months out.
We do have a first draft correct who should be giving one.
That's right. I have asked over to. So to keep in mind this, not everything's purely about astronomy. It's about social theory, approaches, methodologies, frameworks, tools, and technologies, anything that anybody in cultural astronomy is going to use, which is everything. So it's just bringing different perspectives. So we've unpacked theoretical texts here, then we're going to get into deep diving into the science side of things, and we're going to explore education and all kinds of other stuff. So I think everything's pretty much set up for the next 2 or 3 months, but the website, if it's blank, it's open. When you email me, date, topic, and paper or book, right? So appreciate it, and see everybody in a month. Thanks everybody online.